Okay, so welcome everyone. For those of you who have not met me before, although I do have a number of folks here in the room today with us that I've met in person. So my name is Haruka Radobush. I'm the Senior Programs Manager at the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California, based in San Francisco's Japantown. And we're really excited to be here today as part of Tadaima's virtual pilgrimage to bring you a small group discussion for the community focused on Shin Nikkei folks and our relationship with the World War II incarceration. So as a basic premise of this discussion, we wanted to highlight a segment of the Japanese American community that has been here a little bit more recently than many other folks in our community who, at this point, many folks are sansei, yonsei, gosei, third, fourth, fifth generation. And part of that experience in our community has included having a direct tie to the history of the community's incarceration during World War II. For the Shin Nikkei, though, Shin in Japanese sort of being a prefix meaning new, we are folks whose families came over, emigrated from Japan post World War II. So our families did not have to go through the mass incarceration that the rest of the community experienced. However, being part of the same community, I feel like there are many times where it's necessary for us to be able to understand that part of our community's history and our place, alongside it. And I think it's something that doesn't necessarily come automatically for many Shin Nikkei, as part of their experience being Japanese American, and it's something that has to be imparted to them in part through exposure to the broader Japanese American community and that experience, and to making connections with folks that did either live through that experience or had families who whose lives and the trajectory of their experience was greatly impacted by it. So for today's session, though, I did want to begin with a little bit of background information on Shin Nikkei and who we are. And so I'm actually going to put a link in the chat here to a PDF of a report that was published back in 2011 by the University of Maryland, as well as the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League. And it's a demographic study on the general Japanese American community, and it's based off of data collected from the 2009 American Communities Survey conducted by the US Census Bureau. And so that is sort of the most comprehensive report that I've found on demographics in the Japanese American community. With the most recent national T20. So there should be more reports that are forthcoming based on the data that gets released from that survey. So it's going to be interesting to look at how demographics in the Japanese American community have changed. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bring up this report. So, all right. So let me know if the report is up on your screen for everyone. I know share screen kind of takes a moment sometimes. Does everyone see the report? Okay, getting a thumbs up. So yeah, this is the report that was published by the University of Maryland in collaboration with the JACL. It's a demographic overview of Japanese Americans. And so feel free to keep the PDF that I linked to in the chat. It's really a really great report, lots of great information in there if you haven't already seen some of it before. And although it's a little dated, I know that I think a lot of the information here is still very informing of the current state of our community. And you can probably speculate in your mind and extrapolate how some of the trends have carried over the last 10 years to the present day since this report was published. But the report gives, historical context as well as just the actual data, and gives breakdowns in terms of different demographic groups and by generation as well for some of the categories. So it's pretty interesting to look at. But one thing in particular that I wanted to start with is to look at the historical timeline to two very specific dates that are relevant to Shin Nikkei in the JA community. And so one is the year 1952. So in this timeline, um, the history here notes that in 1952, the Senate overrides President Truman's veto and votes the McCarran Act into law, which revokes the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. So as many of you guys know, the Asian Exclusion Act was legislation that significantly limited the immigration that came from mainland or to the mainland from Japan. So prior to that, I think previous generations of Japanese Americans that formed our community, immigrated prior to the Asian Exclusion Act being enacted. And so it was finally revoked in 1952. So yeah, as the report states, the bill permits a small number of Japanese to immigrate to the US and allows Issei to become naturalized US citizens. So this is also significant to the JA community with respect to, I guess the aspects of naturalization and gaining citizenship, thereby really formally establishing permanent residency and sort of the intent to build a life here in the United States. So I guess prior to that, everyone who had immigrated, was not necessarily allowed to be a U.S. citizen or naturalized. And I think being able to naturalize really, I guess changes even like a Shin Nikkei individual's perspective from identifying as someone who is a Japanese national or Japanese to being part of the Japanese diaspora, part of the Nikkei community. And so I think that's a very significant date for us to note. And then the next date as well, 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 rejected the nationality origins as a basis for distributing immigration quotas among countries and creates new quotas of 20,000 immigrants for any country. And it also gives preference to skilled workers and encourages family reunification. So this act itself also really opened up the doors to immigrants coming in from Asia to the United States. And so that's really where you see the rapid growth of Asian American communities throughout the country, from this point forward. And I think that's also significant too, in terms of talking about the Japanese American communities, I guess, in comparison with other Asian ethnic groups in the United States. So prior to this date, Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans were the most populous groups of Asian Americans here in the US. And at the same time, because of patterns of immigration, and also factors like refugees coming over from armed conflicts in Asia. You had other ethnic groups that were coming over to the United States and forming communities here. And I guess the migration patterns or immigration patterns indicates that immigration from Japan kind of slowed down over time. And it hit another boom, I'd say, in the 80s. And, my own family was part of that wave of immigrants to the United States in the 1980s. But since then, immigration from Japan really hasn't been on the same at the same rate as other countries such as like China or Taiwan or Korea or places like India also, right? There's a lot of immigration, and part of that is also due to the strike in 1965 favoring skilled workers. And so you have a different type of immigration coming over from Asia, or if you look specifically at Japan as well, you tend to have folks that are part of a more globalized workforce that are coming over in more recent years in comparison to, I'd say, a lot of the immigrants that came over in the Issei and Nisei, the traditional Issei and Nisei waves of JA immigrants to the community. And as we know, like, we have a very proud legacy in the JA community of JA's role in developing agricultural industries here in the United States and providing labor for that. And similarly, when you look at immigration into Hawaii, right, where a lot of our initial immigration from Japan came from, we were providing a lot of labor for the plantations there, right? So I'd say there are differences that are shaped by the I guess the nature of the labor force coming over to immigrate in our community as well. But going further down into this report, you'll have different sections that go into the social and economic characteristics, things like health statistics and generational statistics. But one general graphic that I wanted to go over here was this pie chart here that sort of breaks down by generation up through second generation and beyond in the community as of 2009. So I've seen projections of our population that have given sort of an updated view of this look at our generational breakdown as a community. But in general, as of 2009 at least, first generation Shin Nikkei folks made up 36.1% of the total US Japanese American population. And then this would be people of Japanese ethnic origin residing in the United States. So not necessarily everyone included here would self-identify as Japanese American necessarily. So they could be Shin Nikkei or Japanese nationals included in this. But then we have 1.5 generation, 7.6. So I myself call myself Shin Issei, first generation, but I think my own cultural experience is closer to that of 1.5 generation. And that's for folks that have parents of a mixed generation. So they might have one parent who is an Issei immigrant and another parent who is Nisei or Sansei or Yonsei. So they're sort of a hybrid of having the Issei immigrant cultural experience, but also having a foot into more established, generationally at least, cultural experience of Asian American or Japanese Americans that have been here for multiple generations. And then for folks who are second generation and beyond in the community, that's 56.3%. So, another statistic that isn't necessarily represented in this pie chart is that I've heard that at this point, a third of the JA community identified as mixed race or mixed ethnicity. And so in my mind, I kind of based on the 2009 statistics, kind of would break down the big groups of this the JA community into thirds, where one third would be Shin Nikkei folks, another third would be sort of Sansei Yonsei generational cohorts, and then another third would be our mixed race folks in our community. So that was kind of like a very bird's eye view, like way of breaking down in general in the community, but I've seen projection statistics that are saying that over half of our community when they come in. But I'll let you guys sort of just explore the report at your leisure. So you'll find as a community in the United States, but also report to look at, and I'm hoping that it gets updated once the full set of 2020 census data is released. But with that, I'm going to stop the screen share and oh, okay. Sorry. Seems my internet connection is a little unstable. But with that, I did want to go and initially had a planned panel to open this session as well with a couple of Shin Nikkei folks that I'd invited on, representing different areas of the country as well as different age groups within our community as well. And unfortunately, two of my folks, one here in Northern California and then another based in the East Coast in New York, were unable to join us today. But I do have one friend of mine, Kaz Sato, joining us from the greater Cincinnati area here, who is Shin Nikkei. And I'd like Kaz to share a little bit about himself, and we can sort of model sort of the things that Kaz shares to, model our own, pieces that we share about ourselves in our discussion today. So Kaz, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, where you're from, and sort of your family story and how you came to the U.S.
Okay, my name is Kaz Sato. Actually, my first name is Kazuya, but most people just cut down their mind and can't pronounce my name and just saying Kaz. Anyway, I was born in Japan, 1942. So if I were born in this country, I would have been born in camp, I think. Anyway, my parents, my father was a school teacher. My mother was a homemaker and was grown up in Yamanashi. Kofu is the capital of Yamanashi Prefecture, there until 18, and came out to Tokyo for college. Actually, as you know, that the college prep schools is around, and I failed one exam, and so I spent 1 extra year in Tokyo.
Are we already on daylight time?
And then I graduated from college called International Christian University, which is slightly different from other Japanese community. So I was more into sort of never land of between Japan and international things, mostly American.
Mm-hmm.
And then came to United States in '65 to pursue my schooling. And so I came as a J1, not foreign student, but the foreign visitor or something. And I stayed till 1970. My wife, in the meantime, I married my wife, Betsy, who is from Ohio, and she's Caucasian. That is another interesting thing. 1966, you're not supposed to be married in some of the places. Interracial marriage was prohibited, and like Indiana, we were married in Ohio, and Michigan was where we were going to school, so we didn't have any problem. But anyway, my life in the United States is surrounded by Caucasian family. My wife was going into Japanese studies, so in that sense, my toes or my foot was kept in Japan side of things. And then she had a PhD study in Japan. So we went back to Japan, and normally I was in Fulbright, so I was supposed to be staying in Japan for 2 years, but they gave us extra consideration. We could come back to the United States in 1971. So, and all through that time, I've been with the periphery of Japan in college environment. In 1972, my wife found a job in Cincinnati teaching Japanese history. So we came down to Cincinnati and immediately got snagged by Japanese American group, JACL group, that were teaching Japanese studies to school teachers. And then international festivals that we were brought in to help them out and this and that. So I have been, it's quite a little bit of a unique situation from Japanese, just came from Japan, I guess, because half of my foot is in Japanese thing, half of my foot was in American things. And in 1987, I found out that Toyota was building automotive plant in Georgetown, Kentucky, which is only about 60 miles south of Cincinnati. And I found a job there and started working for them until 2009. So I get involved with the Japanese culture that way. But I find that the things, what I feel and how I feel about Japan and US is a little bit different from those people who are coming from Japan with the company and stayed. And I feel a little bit different from Nisei people who are brought up in the United States, but both parents are Japanese and keep doing things Japanese food and customs and stuff like that. So I'm in between, kind of strange situation. I'll stop it there, and if you have any question, please ask me.
Great, thanks so much, Kaz. So yeah, I think a large focus on today's discussion that I wanted you guys to all explore was how being Shin Nikkei kind of puts us in an interesting position that gives us a different experience, a different lived experience.
Kind of broke up.
I guess our Sansei and Yonsei counterparts of other like maybe Asian American groups. Yes. Hello? All right.
You're kind of cutting, Haruka.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think that's just based on the strength of my connection. But so I guess I wanted folks to go around and introduce yourselves. We'll call on folks to go. And so if you could maybe speak on your own experience if you are Shin Nikkei, and you know, talk about sort of how there might be similarities or differences that you've observed in your cultural identity and experience, whether it's through, you know, food, language, what media, you know, you consume or are familiar with, you know, cultural touch points, or as Kaz was mentioning, you know, things like customs, you know, practices in the home, that sort of thing. Because I think something that I've observed is that, you know, Shin Nikkei in general, because our cultural experience is a lot more closely tied to current Japan, our cultural understanding is a little bit different from, I think, Sansei Nyonsei, whose families, you know, carried on the cultural traditions that were in Japan at the time of their families crossing over to the United States. So we have sort of different diverging paths of cultural development that our own experience with our Japanese backgrounds reflects. But that's something that I definitely want folks here to share what they've observed, whether or not you are Shin Nikkei or Sansei or Yonsei. With that, then if you guys could introduce yourselves, I'll go first. I'm Haruka again, and I'm in San Francisco. My family immigrated when I was 2 years old from Tokyo. My father at the time was attending a graduate program at San Francisco State University. So that's the reason my family came, but then they ended up staying because they felt like they had better economic opportunities here to establish a life for our family. And then, interestingly enough, my parents divorced, and my biological father moved back to Japan, and my mom remarried to my stepfather, who is American. So that's how I have an American last name, but I'm actually 100% Japanese. I think for our Shin Nikkei folks too, I'd like you guys to maybe explain at what point you realized that you were part of the Nikkei community as opposed to being Japanese and considering yourself like a Japanese national. So at one point, did your own identity maybe transition as well? So um, yeah, why don't we start off with Sam, since Sam, you're the first person here in our session today. If you might share with us your own experience, if what generation you are, and if you're not Shin Nikkei, certainly if you can share any sort of experiences you've had where you've gained an understanding of maybe the sort of cultural nuances between JAs and Shin Nikkei.
Okay, thank you. Did you mean Sam Mihara? I just want to make
Yes.
sure. Okay.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts. I'm a Nisei. I was born in San Francisco. I went to Heart Mountain at age 9. Stayed there for 3 years. Eventually went back to San Francisco by way of Salt Lake City. It was a very, very difficult time. My father went blind in camp, mainly because General DeWitt would not let him go back to see his specialist. There was no one in camp who knew how to take care of glaucoma. My grandfather also died a horrible death in camp. And for all of that, I was very bitter for a long time. But eventually, after I retired from the Boeing company as a rocket scientist, I turned to teaching, and that's what I do right now. I teach all over the country. A lot of people in the country don't know about the history of the imprisonment of Japanese Americans. So I find it very, very satisfying to educate people. I do have a question, though, for the Shin Nikkei. One reason why the Japanese in 1942 did not resist going to the camp. One reason is they were trained in Japan to always trust the government, that the government is always right, that you should never challenge the government. And resistance was unheard of because that's what they were taught when they were young in Japan. And they brought that culture with them when they came to the US. And my question is, as Shin Nikkei, post World War II, was that thought being perpetuated in Japan? Are the schools in Japan still teaching right after the war that the government is always right and you should trust them? I'm curious as to whether that thought was being taught throughout Japan when you were young. Anyone having a comment? As it caused, especially you were, I think, at that age, who might recall.
Well, I don't think there was a kind of government effort to crush the people who are against it. What I say, maybe we should put it the other way. When I was growing up, there was earlier, the communists were very strong and coming back, and and socialist was strong power too. And there were movement against what the Japanese government is trying to do. But on the other hand, the society itself has sort of general feeling or general way of following the authority figures. You have to follow your grandparents, your father, and all that kind of stuff. So there are two ways. I think there's a possibility of people who revolt against the government, just like the people who are against the Japan-America, the involvement, the treaty that becoming the member of American defense strategy as well. And then at the same time, you don't go out and, and everything what the government does is something that you feel like your freedom is being impinged on, just like what's going on right now with the COVID. The Japanese are a little bit more willing to take what the leaders in the government is trying to do, wearing masks, taking vaccines and stuff like that. I feel, and I'm sure that Japanese in Japan feel kind of strange to see Americans, and the same way I've seen something that the Australians are doing and the British are doing, that it's individual freedom is much more important than social, welfare and welfare of society as a whole.
All right. So I think just so we can get everyone involved, let's just do a quick round of introductions first, and then we can get into more in-depth discussion amongst everyone. So why don't we have Hiro introduce yourself next?
I'm Hiro Nishikawa. My whole name is Alfred Hirotoshi Nishikawa. That's on my birth certificate and driver's license. I'm a third generation American of Japanese descent. I'm a sansei. My parents, however, were Kibe. They were born in California, but they were raised in Japan as kids, because after World War I, there was a recession in the United States, and my grandparents, who were immigrants, were farm workers, and to survive, they went back to Yamaguchi-ken, where they're from originally. So I have a kind of a mixed bag experience as a sansei, and because of that. So as a kid, while we were in Poston, Arizona, Camp 1, we were not supposed to speak Japanese in the household. But because my mother and father were conversant in Japanese, having grown up in Japan, they talked to us every day at home in the barracks in Japanese. So I heard Japanese spoken and learned phrases, about common things, irashai, tadaima, those kinds of phrases. And that continued until we went back to California after the war and into the Bay Area. And we ended up in Gilroy, California, now the garlic capital of the world. An agricultural town of about, I don't know, at that time, only 4,000 or 5,000 people. It's probably now around 40,000. Anyway, the experience there, I grew up among a lot of people in the JCL, etc. And so the prevailing, and my parents never talked about camp life. So as a kid, we never heard anything details in terms of what they suffered through. And I got interested in Nikkei history after I finished Berkeley, and that has become my hobby for the rest of my life. And in the last 20 years since I've retired, I've done a lot of reading, and this is one of the reasons for wanting to join this conversation group, because of the unique situation of Shin Nikkei. And so I'm interested in finding out the different experiences that they incurred, because even my so-called Nisei and Sansei experience is not the routine that you would run across in the JACL.
Mhm.
And one thing that came to mind was the handling of the whole war experience. And a phrase called gambare was used a lot. In other words, my parents' generation basically said it was gambare that allowed them to withstand the intolerance and so on, and the maltreatment by the US government. And so as kids, without explaining to us why, they said, you have to learn gambare, because as you grow up, that's what's going to allow you to survive any adversity. You know, and after the holding of 100 Americans hostage in Iran during the administration by Carter, a psychological term came out, because the people who were trapped or held by the people in Iran, when they were released back to the States, a lot of them talked like my parents did. We must have done something wrong in our life that gave us this bad luck. And they call that post-traumatic distress syndrome. And then finally, all that came together in my head as to what my parents and their generation went through. Anyway, let me just stop at that. And I'm interested in hearing other stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiro. All right. Next, why don't we go to Lisa?
Hi everyone. I am, I guess, Shin Nikkei or maybe Shin 1.5, 1.5. I was born in Tokyo. My mom's Japanese, my dad is white, and we moved to the US when I was 3. And so I grew up here. I went back to Japan almost every year to see my mom's family. My mom was also a Japanese teacher at a public high school. So she was pretty insistent on me learning Japanese, and she spoke Japanese to me my whole life. And now I actually teach Japanese. So I've connected with Haruka. That way I offer Japanese language classes at the community center once a month. Yeah, I guess I've been really interested in thinking about the specific topic of Shin Nikkei, Shin Nikkei to the camps, because I'm also a translator from Japanese, and recently I've been working on a project with some other folks to translate materials that were written in Heart Mountain and the camps. So Sam, yeah, I was really interested in what you were talking about. In the Heart Mountain internment camps, people who were incarcerated there wrote poetry and essays while they were there, actually like 6 or 7 volumes of a literary journal called the Hatomanten Bunge. And so the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, which is the museum that's there now, got a grant recently to translate that material. So I've been working on translating some of that. But I guess during the process, I've been thinking a lot about my position or my relationship to this history, since my family was not incarcerated in the camps. I think part of that it means that, you know, my access to Japanese language means like, yeah, basically like I have the privilege of having access to Japanese language, partly because my family was not interned in the camps. So yeah, it's really complicated, but I also feel like it's a really important project to make that material accessible to the descendants of those people who might not necessarily speak Japanese anymore, precisely because they were incarcerated. So I've been thinking a lot about language access and language issues, and yeah, my relationship to that history. So yeah, really glad to be here, and it's really great to hear about everyone's experiences.
Thanks, Lisa. And yeah, it's great to see you here too, and fun to see a familiar face from other contexts in the community. All right, why don't we go next to Joyce?
Hi, I'm Joyce Nakamura from San Francisco, and I'm Sansei, but I want to be really brief about that history because I don't think that's what we're here for, or that's not why I'm here. My history is very traditional in terms of my grandparents coming here at the turn of the century, 20th century. They were farmers, they went to camp, et cetera, et cetera. But I was interested in this discussion because I read that report that Haruka introduced to us at the beginning. And it kind of opened my eyes in the sense of like, what is the future of the Japanese American community? Because the Sansei cohort, is kind of like shrinking, and like Haruka said, I think the mixed race and Shin Nikkei are really the future of our community, and I want to understand that better, in terms of, like Haruka was saying, the demographics of that. What are the needs of that community? And in San Francisco, since there's been a lot of discussion about the future of Japantown, I really feel that the point of view of these cohorts should really be incorporated in terms of the future of the community. So that's one thing I'm interested. And in terms of this discussion topic of the concentration camp experience, I'm really interested in how that history has impacted Shin Nikkei and their own sense of being Japanese American.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Joyce. Next, why don't we hear from James? Good to see you, James.
Hi, Haruka. Hi, everyone. My name is James Okumura. Sansei is kind of what I classify myself generally, but I'm kind of Nisei-han, I guess. My paternal side is, grandparents immigrated from Mieiken in the early part of the 20th century, and farmers and so on. They were renunciants repatriated to Japan. My dad joined the army, married my mother in the 50s, and then they came over here, part of her for the first time. So she's kind of the Shin Issei, I guess. And the both of them are passed away, but they came in the 50s. And so I classify myself as Sansei, or Nisei-han, I guess, is kind of where I land. The areas that I'm kind of interested in, one are identity issues related to Shin Issei, and that's kind of because a lot of the common themes span generations. We see it so many times with so many other groups and other peoples that generationally the same issues or similar issues manifest themselves, maybe in perhaps a little bit of a different way, but they still occur. The other thing that I'm interested in is from the Shin Issei is the Japanese experience on the other side of the Pacific, and it's more of the senso mae, senso chu, senso go, before, during, and after the war, and not necessarily their own direct experiences, because a lot of the elders are long since passed away, but things that they may have heard or experienced. There's a publication called it's in Japanese, and it's called Magotachi Eno Shogen, I think is what it's called. It's testimonials to the grandchildren. And it's a lot of testimonials about the Japanese experience amongst the common people, not the government, you know, some of the soldiers as well as children and everyday people. And those are kind of the things, it kind of opened my eyes to the experience on that side of the ocean during the war. So those are the kinds of things that I'm kind of interested in: identity, and then again, the experience of Shin Nikkei before, during, after the war.
Thanks, James.
Sure.
All right, next, why don't we go to Setsuko?
Oh, okay. I guess I'm Nisei, post World War II Nisei. My parents were Shin Nikkei. My father actually came in 1953. He was, I believe that the McCarran Act allowed 100 Japanese to enter the United States or something like that, or, you know, and a certain number to naturalize. So the people who were allowed to naturalize were actually Japanese who had been here a long time, but never allowed to naturalize. And for the first time, they were allowed to become US citizen. So I don't think my father was allowed to naturalize, but he came on a student visa as a, I think they came as houseboys. He went to Los Angeles Community College, and he was able to, he lived on top of the garage of Signal Oil Company executives' garage, yeah. And worked, went to college. He worked, he worked at the Broadway department store with a cleanup crew in the morning, and then went to school all day, and then worked at Larry's Steakhouse as the busboy. And so then he decided he wanted to get he wanted to get a scholarship, and he ended up getting a full scholarship. He had a partial scholarship to NYU and to Columbia, but he got a full scholarship to Kentucky State College, which became Kentucky State University, but it turned out to be a historically Black college in Kentucky. And he didn't know that there was Jim Crow laws. So I think somewhere in the middle of the state, like Oklahoma or Arkansas, he took a Greyhound bus. And when they got off to the bathroom, he discovered that there were white and Black bathrooms, and he didn't know which one to go to. So he just went to the one that was least crowded. But when he ended up at Kentucky State College, his commencement speaker was Martin Luther King. Yeah. So, but you know, he got a full ride there, and he said that there were it was a mixed bag at the historically Black college. Some people, you know, didn't study very hard, or other people, they really wanted to learn, and he said some of the smartest young people there, you know, he met were really amazing. So, but he ended up in New York, and he started a store called Azuma in the 50s. He actually opened one of the earliest Whole Foods macrobiotic restaurants, but needless to say, in the 50s, they were celebrating, you know, TV dinners and, you know, preservatives. So it didn't do that well, but they learned how to import things from Japan and China and India. And so they had you know, a little store. I was born in New York City. And that's, I basically grew up speaking Japanese to my mom because she didn't really speak English. And we would translate. We would, you know, if the telephone guy came, you know, he would say, what kind of, you know, do you want a princess phone? Do you want to dial up, or do you want a push button? And we would have to translate for my mom. So in many ways, we had to grow up really early. Oh, also the other point about the East Coast is that no Japanese people really live near each other. They were encouraged not to cluster. And I found out that this was a rule that was established by the War Relocation Authority, and New York City was a relocation city. It was Boston, New York, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis. I have a whole list of the relocation cities, which is what I've been researching, but recently. But there were all these rules about people, once they left the camp, they had to report to a relocation officer who would assign you a job, and you were not allowed to quit your job unless you told your relocation person, otherwise you couldn't get another job. And one of the things I realized, that if you didn't report to your relocation officer to the relocation city, which you had to report that that's where you're going to, you could be fined or you could be arrested. So when I saw the cats of Mirakatani, who, he was 9/11, he still hadn't declared that he was alive still. This is 2001, and he was hiding because he thought that he would be in trouble. So I never understood that until I did all this history. And I have to say, I was born in New York City in 1962. I never learned about any of this history. And in fact, I did meet a Japanese American when I was younger, and I was introduced to this Japanese American boy who was, his family had been there before. And I said, "Oh, you're Japanese?" And he said to me, "No, I'm an American." And he wouldn't speak. He said, "I don't speak Japanese." And I have to say that Japanese Americans were kind of hostile to Japanese people. And I think they tried to distance themselves from Japanese to say, "Hey, I'm not like you. I'm an American, I'm not Japanese." And as a Japanese American who knows ise from Japan, and now I live in the Berkshires, and I'm like the only Asian person anywhere. Until recently, I found like 10 Japanese women married to white men. And none of us knew that there were any other Japanese people. And I've been doing this research. None of them want to know about the story. They're not taught, they weren't taught it in Japan. We're not taught about it in America. And they don't want to know about it. It's almost, in fact, there was a group of Japanese, women's, lunch meeting that there's like 10 of them who meet. And it started before COVID. And they found out about my project, and they were kind of, they're like, "Well, we don't really." I was told by one of them that they really don't want to know about this. And because it's, as an immigrant, it's hard to be critical of your host country, because they're here, they're not, or they became citizens because of their husbands, but if they're also immigrants, it's really hard for them to be, to say these critical things, because it's saying that America, it's not saying very nice things about America or the American government. And it sort of gives a lie to the four freedoms, which is right here in Massachusetts, where I live, Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where the Four Freedoms paintings painted by Norman Rockwell is just 40 minutes away. And, they had a huge celebration of it, and they were sending it around the country. And I did this art project, and I was originally invited to be part of it. But in the end, they decided not to have my project in there, and they had no Japanese story in the entire exhibit that traveled around the country. Yeah.
feel
So-
that some of the Japanese, not the ones that were married to American soldiers, but the people who came as a part of Japanese industries and stayed, they seem to be, at least my take is that things has happened is not my story, somebody else's story, and we don't want to get involved. And it's sort of like a third person looking up from outside, looking in, you know, what's going on and with the politics and everything. And they don't want to naturalize. I feel like, you know, they should be naturalized and say something to the society and also contribute, but they don't do that.
Thank you. Let's see, we haven't heard yet from Paula. Why don't we have you share?
Well, thank you. Short story isn't, you know, as I said on my panel on the screen, I'm a Sansei, his family was in Tule Lake. But what was really interesting to me to hear all the Shin Nikkei is that I lived in Paris for 8 years. And there, it's very interesting because I was seen as, quote, an American. There's no Japanese American, Chinese American, you know, there's no hyphenated American, because the French really believe, like, you know, liberté, equalité, égalité, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, just it's not really true. So the government does not even collect data on, you know, where you're from, et cetera. But they have their own trauma. And that's with what they call the Pieds Noirs, which is the the French people who were in Algeria. So when the Algerian War of Independence happened, you know, then there were all these people that these Pieds Noirs had to be repatriated back into France, and that's caused their own big trauma, and that's still going on. And so what you said, Setsuko, about the not being able to criticize when you're in the country. So when I was living in France, you know, I mean, there's a lot that's wrong about the French, but I felt very strongly that I couldn't say those things because I was, you know, I was a guest. I was working there, but it was just the same feeling, like I couldn't say certain things because it didn't belong to me, so to speak.
Right.
So that was really interesting. And the last thing I'll say is that my family has a reunion every year, and last few years has been virtual. So I was looking around the panel, and you see the screen, and there are some. I have some Shin Nikkei in my family. My aunt, you know, was from Japan. Her kids were born in Tokyo. I have a cousin whose wife is from Kyoto, and they have children, etc. So, and a lot of what I was the host. So what I did was a lot on the Japanese American experience. But then I realized I was doing this, that some of my family did not experience this at all, because they didn't. I mean, they weren't part of that whole generational thing. So it gave me pause to see how was it that I could incorporate them. So the last thing I'll say is there was one thing I said, name some famous Japanese or Japanese American actors. So there's this, it was his name, Kaoru Kobayashi. I put his picture up. He's from Midnight Diner. So my Shin cousins, you know, the wife says, "Oh, it's Kaoru Kobayashi." I would have never known. I mean, I knew the name because of Midnight Diner, but he's famous in and of itself in Japan, right? Not because of Midnight Diner. So that was interesting. She knew who, you know, who he was, out of the context of what we would see on Netflix here in the States. So anyway, just these are anecdotal things that, you know, relate. I mean, of course, I'm Sansei. I grew up in Sacramento, Japanese American community, blah, blah, blah. Same kind of story that, you know, we hear a lot of JAs talk about, but what the Shin Nikkei are saying is very interesting, having lived abroad. Thanks.
Thanks, Paula. All right, and we have 2 more folks that we need to hear from. So we have one person who is a call-in participant on their phone, so we can't see your name, but if you wouldn't mind coming on and sharing with us.
Hi, this is Marge Taniwaki from Denver, Colorado. I'm on the phone. I can't see anyone because I wasn't able to log in. I'm sure it's my lack of technical ability. I'm Sansei and a half. My father was a Yobiyose. He was called here by his father and emigrated himself in the early 1920s. My mother was a Kibe, born in San Francisco and raised in Yokohama, raised and educated in Yokohama. I spent the first 4 years of my life at Manzanar and suffered from the same trauma that others who were imprisoned have experienced. I've spent most of my time trying to learn and educate myself and then go out and speak about the incarceration. My purpose in joining this group today is to, again, learn as much as I can, especially about the Shin Nikkei, just to help me in learning as much as I can and then being able to add that to the programs that I go out and speak about in the general public.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad you can still participate over the phone. So thanks for being here with us.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, and I think our last person in our group today will be Yuki.
Hi, like Haruka said, I'm Yuki. I think I consider myself Shin Nikkei. My mom immigrated from Osaka, Japan to the United States in like the mid 90s. And my dad is white, so I'm also mixed race as well. And I think I also have I was also really interested in this conversation because I feel like I'm, as somebody who's involved or participates in JCL and other Japanese American community organizations, I think it's like I feel like I always try to figure out how can I support, and then also realize when, you know, like in terms of when it's like centering myself or not, or like really being try to be aware of like what space I'm in, especially in the Japanese American community, because I know that my family history is different and everything. So I try to it's be aware of that. And then that's why I really wanted to join this conversation too, because I felt like it would be interesting to hear how other people that are, you know, Shin Nikkei handle that as well, because I, similar to what other people said, I understand also the privilege I have being able to, I can't really read and write Japanese very well, but speaking Japanese, I understand kind of like the privilege that comes with, because I'm lucky that my mom was able to teach that to me growing up. And so how I can use whatever skills I have to like give back to the Japanese American community, and at the same time understanding, you know, what kind of spaces I'm in, and just like continuing to listen and learn and everything from from Japanese American community leaders and things like that. And I think I also like I've been part of like the San Jose Buddhist Church Betsun community, and through that I think, well, I went to Dharma school first, so I think a lot of like the ministers and things like that knew me first, and but they were like looking for more people to help out at the Japanese language school. So that's how like my mom got involved with the temple community, helping out teaching Japanese language. And so I think kind of through that and me not really being at the place where I could teach Japanese fully, because I can really only speak, but being more of a bridge between the leadership of the Japanese language school and the temple, I think it was really interesting for me to see like how do like Shin Issei connect to the Japanese American community. And like this was an instance where I think I was told a lot that, or I kind of saw even within like our family friend circle, that not everybody had a similar experience as me of going to Dharma school and things like that. Not many people that are like me in my similar generation really participated in the Japanese American community. So seeing like, okay, well, actually here's like, it's a small group, but a small group of Shin Issei who are, you know, a part of like the temple network, like how do they connect? Like, how does that challenge them or anything like that? I think was something I was really interested in. So that's kind of what I've been, I think, focusing on as well in college, is trying to figure that out too, like connections between more recent immigrant generations and then those that have established themselves for many generations before them. So yeah, I really appreciate this space and look forward to learning more from everyone here.
Great. Thanks, Yuki. So I think at this point, I do want to relate a little bit of my own story into the discussion. So being Shin Nikkei, I grew up in the Bay Area, came over when I was 2 years old, but I think for me, my own cultural identity was very centered in identifying myself as being Japanese. You know, being a naturalized citizen, I think it was a little bit more of a direct experience, right? I still have relatives in Japan. I speak to my mom in Japanese primarily. And you know, when I was growing up, I grew up in the suburbs that was fairly culturally isolating in that respect. So by the time I got to college, I was looking for spaces to explore my Japanese identity. But then I came into, you know, the Nikkei Student Union on my campus at UC San Diego. And that really was my first exposure to a broader Japanese American community. And it really expanded my understanding of my own identity at that point to understanding that I was in fact Japanese American. I was part of the Nikkei diaspora at that point, you know, because my family had transitioned to being naturalized citizens and, you know, really had no intention of returning to Japan at any point and resuming life as a Japanese person in this world, you know, but, you know, being part of this broader multicultural American society. So that was, you know, a pretty significant step in my personal identity development. But then, you know, being part of a Nikkei community, you know, it gave me, you know, a direct connection to friends whose families were part of the incarceration, right? And also, I think these days to be involved with the Japanese American community is largely a matter of personal choice for folks. And the way that a lot of people find ways to engage is through community organizations, right? And joining, you know, groups like the JACL or, you know, say like going to programs at a local community center if you're fortunate enough to live near one, right? And so for me, my experience and relationship with the incarceration history is tied very much to my engagement in the Japanese American community in general. But I think for me, my personal connection also, and why the history resonates for me, is that I think my vantage point from being the child of an immigrant is a deep appreciation and understanding of how difficult things are, how challenging it is to be an immigrant and to build a life in this country. And seeing what happened to our community in the wartime makes me all that much more aware of everything that was lost by our community. You know, really empathizing how much people's sacrifices were all just taken away from them. And I think that profound sense of loss is something that, something that I feel like I need to honor in some way, as far as how I engage with my community now. So that's part of the reason why with organizations like the JCL that have such a strong central focus on the incarceration experience, and I realized that, just because I didn't experience it directly because my family wasn't connected directly, just because of that doesn't mean that, as a member of our broader JA community, that I'm not in some way affected and connected to it as well. But I wanted to hear from other Shin Nikkei folks too, if they might be able to share at what point were they introduced to like the history of the wartime incarceration, and what sort of connection had they felt, or has their understanding and connection to it grown since they were first introduced to it?
I can share a little bit. I feel like pretty late in life for me. And I think one reason is that my mom came to the US when she was 30 already. So she was, had lived her entire life in Japan up until that point. So she came to the US when she was 30 and lived here for the next 25 years. But at no point during that time did she ever consider herself Japanese American or even American. She was Japanese. And so I feel like implicit in that was like her sort of, despite her living here, sort of distancing herself from Americanness and Japanese Americanness. And we weren't part of any Japanese American community. She had friends that were other Japanese immigrants or Japanese people that had come here recently, but we really had little or any connection to other Japanese Americans. And I think she also maybe sort of implicitly discouraged me from identifying as Japanese American, because we were Japanese and that was like very important. So I feel like I really had to come to it on my own much later in life, just meeting people, outside my family, meeting friends who had that family experience. And then, just kind of critically thinking about it on my own, okay, I didn't have a familial connection to this event, but clearly it has affected a lot of people who share my history in some way. And I'm, interested in it and want to learn more about it. But it's certainly not a history that was taught to me in my family or in the schools, at any point. So I think I'm still continuing to think about my relationship to it.
I can share my first time that I heard, and I've said this before on one of the Tadaima programs, but I learned about it when I was 13, and a substitute teacher came in and brought in a book called Farewell to Manzanar, which was first published in 1973. And I think she just did it on her own. She was like, oh, Japanese student, let's bring this book in. And she told the story about how all these Japanese were rounded up during World War II. And everybody just sat there really quiet. And one boy said, that doesn't happen in America. That's something that happens in Nazi Germany. And the teacher was like, no, it happened here. And then another boy said, well, if it happened, then she ought to know, pointing at me. And the whole class looked at me and the teacher, and I had never heard anything about this. And I just wanted to just disappear and shrink under the table, under my desk. And I had to say, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about it. So they said, see, didn't happen. And that was about the last I really heard about it. But, on the East Coast, there were just Japanese. We didn't know any Japanese Americans who had come before the war. I think they just kept to themselves, or they they avoided Japanese people, or a lot of them, if they were in the camps, they were forbidden to learn Japanese, so they didn't learn any Japanese. So often, I know my parents, my mom, her English wasn't very good. So she was so happy when she met another Japanese person, they could speak in Japanese and they could talk about the food that they liked, or, I don't know, they could just talk about things that they could reminisce. And so I think when they met a Japanese American, it's just like meeting another American in a way. So so a lot of people are like, well, they're Japanese, and they think that there's supposed to be a connection, but there isn't. So I know that when I go to Japan, I'm called an American. I'm always an American when I go to Japan. She's Amerikajin. When I'm in America, I'm Nihonjin desu, Kanojo Nihonjin desu. So, I speak and read and write Japanese. I worked for a Japanese securities firm, Nikko Securities, which no longer exists in New York. They were all Japanese from Japan. I also worked for NHK on an English language program. And then I ended up going back to journalism school, and I worked for NPR for 10 years. And at NPR, I did several World War II anniversary shows. And there many times they said, they never mentioned the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. And they said that things like the concentration camps or the lack of freedoms that happened under Nazi Germany could never happen in the United States because of FDR and the Four Freedoms. And they say that all the time. And they were actually saying this during 2017, 2019, during the anniversary, the 75th anniversary of the Four Freedoms. So anyway, the whole time that I was at NPR, there was this denial of any of this happening. And one of the first shows I did was this was at a local member station at WNYC before I joined NPR in Washington, D.C. But it was the 50th anniversary of World War II and the end of World War II, where they had refurbished the Enola Gay and was going to show it for the first time at the Air and Space Museum. And there were so many protests from the American Legion, the air and space industry, from veterans, that the exhibition was closed. It was never seen. And I had gotten a catalog for this show. It was part of the Smithsonian. And this was in journalism school. I went to NYU journalism school, the Carter School of Journalism. And I went to a cafe and I left it there, and I've been haunted ever since, because I've had arguments with World War II historians saying that this show was censored, and they said they don't censor history in America. And I always I was like, yes, they did. And if I had that catalog. But since then, I found a book. There was actually a book written by the curator who did that show. So, and it's called Exhibition Denied. So, but I've been doing lots of research, not necessarily on the Japanese American experience, but on US policies, what the government, who were the parties who wrote this legislation and why, and when they were written, and also the laws that helped make it happen, most of them which happened way before Pearl Harbor even happened, and the plan to put Japanese into concentration camps pre-existed Pearl Harbor. So I've been at dinner parties many times out here where people said, you had to be put away, Pearl Harbor. You had to be nuked, Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor is used as an excuse for all kinds of loss of freedoms in the United States. And they often say Pearl Harbor and 9/11 at the same time. You'll often hear Pearl Harbor with 9/11. So they use 9/11 is the new Pearl Harbor, right? And that's dangerous. Both times those acts were used as a way to remove all freedoms from huge segments of the American population. So I came to this story not as a Japanese person. I came to this story as an American and as a journalist, looking into American history. And for the 75th anniversary, I was invited by the National Archives at Hyde Park, which is part of the FDR library. And they found out that I was visiting all the US concentration camps, all 10 of them. And I documented them with a photograph with 120 hand-pinched yellow T-balls. And they invited me to create a site-specific image at the FDR library. And no news organization would do that story, including NPR, which I've worked for 10 years. And my local NPR station knows about my project, but they're also, did a whole blitz on the Four Freedoms, FDR, and the Norman Rockwell paintings. And they didn't mention the fact that I was literally censored and removed from the show. I was removed from the show. They were supposed to use 4 of my images, and they wanted a facsimile of my T-balls, and they were supposed to travel all around the country and to France. But on the first place that it was supposed to open was in New York City, New York Historical Society. And I found out that at the opening, that my project was removed.
Wow.
So there are some powerful people who do not want this story to be known. So, and one of the details I found out was that napalm was invented at Harvard, on the campus of Harvard, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1942. So, and also the centrifuge for the atom bomb was on the campus of Columbia University. I have 2 cousins that went to Columbia. My sister graduated from Columbia. We don't learn about any of this. And it was called the Manhattan Project because it actually happened in Manhattan. The uranium was stored under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. So.
Tokyo bombing was the bomb used the napalms. Every cities in Japan were bombed in 1945, and most of them are bombed with the napalms. And if you go to Tokyo Museum, it really doesn't tell you napalm, but you can tell that's what's happening at that time.
Yeah, well, actually, there's a book called Napalm, the biography, and it talks all about that. All 66 cities in Tokyo. I mean, try to name 66 American cities. They napalm 66 Japanese cities, destroying from 50% to 90% of every city. And then they dropped 2 atom bombs. So, and then napalm was used on Korea. Korea was napalmed. And there are stories of Korean veterans going back to Korea and seeing like devastation, not a single building in the horizon. And so Japan was napalm, Korea was napalm, they napalmed Vietnam. So the story is that napalm was invented in Vietnam, in the 70s, but it's not true. It was Valentine's Day, 1942. And it was Harvard. It was Harvard University. And it was actually Julius Pfeiffer was the biochemist who graduated from Williams College, which is also right here in Massachusetts in the Berkshires. So Massachusetts has a long history of anti-Asianism. It goes way back. So,
Thanks
and
for sharing that.
that's
Thanks for
the
sharing
history
that.
that I'm looking at right now. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you bring up another interesting aspect of the Shin Nikkei experience is the difference as well, right? So the firebombings of Japanese civilians by the U.S. military is something that my own family experienced from the other side, right? So my grandmother mother has stories about surviving the firebombings of Tokyo during the war, and the hardships that were suffered by the folks that were in the areas that were evacuated immediately in during that time period. And I think a lot of discussion has been had in the Japanese American community about the collective trauma and sort of the generational trauma that has resulted from the wartime incarceration. But similarly, I think, for Japanese people, there are lasting generational effects of having survived things like the firebombings of civilians that is, I guess, happening in parallel. And I think there are a lot of people in Japan that don't talk very openly about those experiences either. And you see some generational effects of that trauma carrying out in very similar ways, I think, that parallel what you might see in the Japanese American community. And I think one thing in particular that I think I note as sort of a common manifestation of all this is the act of hoarding in our homes, right? So I think for a lot of like JA families, older generations have hoarders in their families because they experience, everything being taken from them as a result of the incarceration. And on the flip side, for the folks who are in Japan, they experience, everything being destroyed by acts of war, right? And so I think that's another kind of interesting similarity that I see from, I guess, two different sources of trauma, but kind of converging like manifestations at the same time. But for, I guess, our Shin Nikkei folks, do you guys have your own sort of family connection to the wartime experience from like the Imperial Japanese side that kind of you see play out generationally in your families?
Well, my father was a teacher, so the teacher was treated slightly differently from ordinary folks, and of course he was married and already had a kid, so he didn't have to go to war outside of Japan. He just stayed in Japan, hometown, and helped the trained people. My uncle was in arts illusion. Just after he evacuated from there, the replacement regiment or whatever it was from Kofu was decimated. One of my uncle was in Manchuria, and my grandparents' house was bombed in 1945, July, and then they had to escape from there and come live with our family. And near, there are several houses that our family had and next to our house, and so they stayed there. So I remember living with lots of relatives and cousins and right next door. My father told me that we have a big river separating old city side and new city side. The old city side was bombed and burned up. We lived in this new city side. Trying to get across the river was a really harrowing experience, he said, because the fire was sort of coming at you on the ground level. Anyway, other than that, we have sort of escaped the difficulties of war, except for the general difficulty of not having anything to eat. I used to, when I was, 6th grade or something, was sent to meat store, buy 100 grams of meat a week 100 gram is what, less than a quarter pound or something. And you know, but we were able to manage to eat and house ourselves and clothe ourselves. And 1950s and 60s, everything went upward. So it was okay. But going back to Japanese American experience, since I came here as an adult, my English, as you can see, is not as smooth as you guys. And I had a terrible time trying to read all the assignment in graduate school, 1,000 pages a week kind of thing. When you read about 10 pages an hour, 1,000 pages, it's a very difficult stuff. Anyway, I have come to this Japanese American experience close to me is that, somebody asks you, where are you from? Your name is different and you look Asian. I usually say from Cincinnati, no, before that, and you go back, I came from Michigan. No, where are you really from? I don't mind saying I originally came from Japan a long time ago. But I'm sure my kids who look more Asian than white, they probably feel put up. You don't have to deal with that. I don't have to deal with that. But I have been, as I told you, gotten involved in the JACL thing through teaching about Japan and international festivals and stuff. And started to feel like, why do we keep talking about this wartime experience? It's been 20, 30 years ago. Why? I came to the United States 20 years after the World War II was finished. And within town of Ohio or in a college, I have never been discriminated against. Obviously, I may have been kind of slow in taking what people are saying, but anyway, I thought aren't we getting kind of tired of talking about wartime experience of incarceration? And then dawned on me that as long as you look like Asian, you are always in this country outsider. If you're Black, I think people, unless they open their mouths, if you're from Senegal or something and has an accent, they probably consider the person as an American, just Black. And then I start reading about the incarceration things, and also helped my friend who's Nisei talking about his experience in World War II and incarceration. He was really young, but he was 5 or 6 when he went into the camp and came out about 10 or 11. Anyway, that way I started learn about the situation. And because of this JACO's general ideas, general attitude about discrimination, I started having more, I guess, sensitive antenna about discrimination against Asians. And I got involved with Chinese American folks about the bullying of the Chinese American girl who was adopted, and then she committed suicide, and I got involved in that. And we do have larger number of Chinese Americans in Cincinnati area. Japanese American group declining, and not that many people are active. But I have very good connection with the Chinese American folks, and then been working with them, trying to do, recently had anti-Asian hate demonstrations and protests, and also some of the Chinese scientists being prosecuted, and we demonstrated against that. We just, as a JA in Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area, Cincinnati area, we just can't do much, but we can spread our hand out to other Asian Americans and Chinese American, Korean Americans, and others. We could do things that we wanted to do and we need to do. That's it.
Interesting.
Can I just
Well,
can I just add something as somebody who's worked in journalism for many years, and there are two reasons why it's important, because I felt the same way. Why we still have to, learn about the war? It happened such a long time ago. But one of the problems in journalism is that every 5 years there's the anniversary cycle. So it's the 50th anniversary, the 55th anniversary, the 60th anniversary, 70th, 75th, the 80th anniversary is going to be big. And so is the 90th anniversary. And if all the Japanese people don't know about the history, then they're going to say Pearl Harbor, you had to be put away. And it's going to be that 13-year-old kid in the school that's like, I don't know anything about it. I guess you're right. And I just, I didn't say anything because I didn't know. That's why I feel as an American, I'm not ashamed of being Japanese. I'm very proud of being Japanese. But I felt that not knowing my Japanese American history, which is very different from just white American or even Black American or Japanese immigrant. There is a very specific Asian American and Japanese American history that is relevant to how democracy works or doesn't work. And that's why this example needs to be known for anybody, I think.
right. Well, what I was going to say is this, to supplement what Kaz said. When I grew up in California, I rarely ran across these little microaggressions about being Asian. And only after I moved east to the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey area that I began to experience people, white people, strangers when I meet them at a coffee hour or whatever, at church, any community group, like, where are you from? And I would say, well, I used to live in Pennsylvania or New Jersey, before that. And as I said, finally, I knew where they're going with this question. So I said, well, I was born in San Francisco. Oh, so where did your ancestors come from? Because that's what they wanted to know in the first place. So nowadays, when I run into those types of beginnings of those inquiries, this is called a perpetual foreigner syndrome that Frank Wu has described in his book, Yellow, about racism in America between Black and white. It's a very good book that I've been recommending people to read. It's been out about since 2003. And I met him a number of times. We invited him to give a talk at the JCL luncheon back in early 2000. Anyway, the perpetual foreigner syndrome continues. And so what I've done now is gotten in the habit of introducing myself, Hiro Nishikawa, and depending on the reaction I get from who am I talking to, I'll say, well, Nishikawa is an old American name. And they'll say, what? I said, well, my grandparents came from Japan in 1900. That means Nishikawa name has been in North America for over 120 years. I would consider that an old American name, wouldn't you? Pause. Okay, I get it. You know, so I'm doing more and more of this kind of stuff up front and saying, you know, I'm a third generation American of Asian descent. Put it all out there in front, up front. And by talking also, that's the other thing. If you don't say anything, people make more assumptions about you. So on introduction, I start talking immediately and show them how good my English is, because I used to get comments on that. Okay. And so any number of people in this audience and elsewhere have encountered that. Now, the other thing we haven't really touched on is mixed race marriages. Both of my son and my daughter are married non-Japanese. So my grandkids are half Japanese and half something else, usually English, Scottish. And the thing is, since they don't look Asian, my grandson, if you put him next to certain types of people, looks sort of Asian, but he has black hair and all that kind of stuff. And he's taller than I am now, it's like his father. Anyway, who is English, Scottish descent. Anyway, because of appearance, I've been quizzing them over many, many years about experience of racial discrimination in school. And my grandson went through a Quaker school from kindergarten through high school. And he hardly ever ran into this issue, because his graduating class of 50 students was like a United Nations. And I went to that. And my granddaughters, on the other hand, live only 5 minutes from our house here in Pennsylvania. And because one of them is blonde and blue-eyed, I don't know how the hell that happened. We thought the hospital sent the wrong kid home when baby came home. And the other one is dark-haired, but she looks like she's from the Mideast, has darker skin than normal Japanese, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they hardly ever run into that. In fact, once in a while, somebody might ask, you know, when they introduce their or hear their surname, you know, Japanese surname, how did you get that? You know, that kind of thing. But they hardly get peppered up front by strangers of being Asian, because they don't look Asian. So my son, on the other hand, once in a while in a grocery store or a drugstore with his blonde and blue-eyed daughter in hand, you know, will get looks from other customers thinking, what the hell is this Asian man doing with this white kid, you know, in the grocery store? They don't say anything, but you can tell from the body language, you know, this is what they're thinking. So that continues to be an issue for Asian Americans of all kinds. And I think that the point that Kaz made about accent does, in fact, cause a hindrance in terms of communication. But it's important to trade names and so on. And what I found that is by talking about surnames, you know, with strangers, and learning somebody who has an Italian surname or Czechoslovakian, because I've learned how to identify all these things. I studied German, I can pick out a German family name. That introduces a different conversation in terms of race relations. And for a lot of people that I've run across, you know, they don't mind it. They think it's kind of interesting to have somebody focus on their family name in addition to focusing on my family name. So that is one way of involving people to be on a level playing field, as it were, exchange names, be comfortable with that, and build on it in terms of further communications, you know, like, oh, I knew somebody with that family name and they were such and such, that kind of thing. And so I think for Asians in particular, who are continuing to be suffering from this perpetual foreigner syndrome, I think we need to be prepared up front in your head and how to manage and cope with that in a constructive way, not get upset, not, jump on the other person, etc. And I found that in the last 10 years, that's the way to approach these interactions with strangers who first thing is reacting to your eyes or your hair or whatever.
Of another significant segment of the Shin Nikkei community, and talking about folks who are mixed race, I think there are a lot of mixed race folks in the Japanese American community who are part of military families, right? Where the father was like an American serviceman who maybe was stationed overseas in Japan and married a Japanese national, and then at a later point came back to America with his mixed family. And so we have a lot of mixed race Japanese Americans that were conceived in this way, but don't have an immediate connection to the history of incarceration because of that particular history as well, right? And so I think that's also another interesting segment of the community to talk about, figuring out ways where we can connect with them and integrate them into this broader, understanding of our community as well. But certainly that's something that I think is very dependent on like individual relationships that are formed with folks in terms of their pathways to this understanding. But I want to be respectful of folks' time. I know folks have dropped off, but we scheduled this session to go up through the end of this hour. So, we have 5 minutes left. If there are any parting points that folks would like to share with us before we finish up the session, I'd like to entertain any closing remarks from anyone here today.
Can I just share one fact? Sorry to take
Go
up so
ahead.
much
Yeah.
time. But I think to the point that Kaz made about white and black, the reason why black people are considered American more than Asians is because of US law. The 1790s Naturalization Act said that any alien, anybody who was not of this land, meaning not Native Americans, could naturalize as long as they were white, and they added white to exclude black people, Africans. So that law was in place until 1870. So almost a century, from 1790 to 1870, you had to be white to become an American, to naturalize. So then it was like, well, that's why Asians became a conundrum, because they're like, well, are they white or not? They're not black. And so in 1870s, after the Civil War, there was a attempt to take the word white out of the Naturalization Act. And instead, because they were still trying to take land away from Native Americans, and they also didn't want the new yellow peril, the Chinese who were coming in great numbers and had finished building the railroads, they updated the Naturalization Act to the 1870s Naturalization Act and added whites and persons of African descent or African. So that's why white and African, it never said black, it said white and African. So then Asian people couldn't, petition to be a citizen saying that they were African, because they're clearly not from Africa. They can't prove that they aren't from Africa. So that's why a lot of the discussion on Americanness has been about white and Africans or black for a very, very long time, because legally, those were the only people who could naturalize, basically until 1952.
Exactly. And that's why my parents were raised in Japan, since my grandparents on both sides could not become naturalized. They could not own property in California after 1913 with the alien land law. And
Right.
so I think that had a huge ramification. And by the time 1952 came, the Walter McCarran Act, they were both deceased. And so that had a tremendous impact on my parents, who were American born, fortunately, but were raised in Japan because of their parents couldn't do anything in the US, couldn't settle permanently.
Right. Right. And if you were born here, you even if you were Japanese, you could be a citizen because of the 14th Amendment, you know, which gave birthright citizenship for the first time.
On that point, my father had dual citizenship, de facto. And so when he went to marry my mother in Japan in 1936, he actually went to the city hall and of the prefecture and resigned his Japanese citizenship. And because already in 1935, with the rape of Nanking, everybody on the street in Japan was worried that a world war was coming. And he didn't want to be recruited by the Japanese Imperial Army.
Mm-hmm.
And so he actually, but he had to give up because of the rule of primogeniture. By resigning his Japanese citizenship, he could no longer inherit any property in Japan that was owned by the family. So that was a very significant and profound act of duty that he underwent.
Right. And conscription, mandatory conscription was brought into Japan after, I guess it was the 30s or whatever, because before that, it was military was a very elite group of people, right? The samurai were an elite group. It wasn't something that anybody could do. So it was after the you know, Meiji period was over and you got into Showa, you know, and they put it in mandatory conscription. So a lot of Japanese left Japan because they didn't want to fight. They didn't want to be want to fight. Yeah, they didn't want to be in the military. Yeah. So anyhow, I need to go now, but this was a fascinating discussion. And thank you very much. As you could see, I'm full Japanese, but I have a British immigrant husband.
A woman of great taste.
Yeah.
That's fabulous. I actually, my grandfather used to live in Lenox, Massachusetts, so I'm quite familiar with the Berkshires. So I have fond memories of that area.
Come visit. Come
Yes.
visit. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today's program, but thank you all so much. And especially thank you, Kaz, for sharing your experience with us today. And we hope that we see you again soon at our remaining Tadaima schedule of programs. So hope you learned a lot today and got to engage in a thought-provoking discussion here. And we will see you at our other programs. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.